issues. Our panel will start with a presentation by Nikki van der Gaag. Nikki,
Hi.
do we have you there?
Good morning.
Good morning, Nikki.
Good morning. Good morning. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Tere homikus. I'm delighted to be here. I wish I was with you in person, but as you see, I'm sitting in my office. I've been asked to talk about the challenges involved in shaping policies that help us to reach a world where men and women share unpaid care and domestic work equally, where boys and men are as able as women and girls to show that they care, and where care is valued as productive work. So how can we bring about policy change? In which areas is a policy change needed? And how does policy link to other key changes, such as social norm change? I'm going to try and, sorry. I'm going to start by showing you a short film from the last year's State of the World's Fathers, produced by the Men Care Campaign and Promundo. But I also want to say that it's impossible to talk about policy or gender without bringing in the huge changes that have happened to all of us this year because of the COVID pandemic. So I'm going to try and, at the end, to talk a little bit about that and whether it's possible for COVID to bring about positive changes in active fatherhood. I will share the Men Care film with you first of all, if I can make it work. Okay, thank you. So our research for State of the World's Fathers showed that the majority of men in 7 countries want to care for their children. On average, across the 7 countries in our survey, 85% of men agreed that I will do whatever it takes in the early weeks and months of caring for my newly born or adopted child. Men want to do this, and the word I would have come up with in the Q&A at the beginning, I think, would have been joy. Joy in being a father, joy in having an active father, joy in having a partner who's active and active in fatherhood as well. So what our research for State of the World's Fathers showed as well, and it was a combination of new research and data from various countries, is that, as we all know, there's no country in the world where men and women share care equally. Adding up the time that men and women spend in paid work and unpaid care work, women on average still work more every day compared to men. And the International Labour Organization recognized that over a 15-year time span, across 23 middle and upper income countries with comparable data, the unpaid care gap between men and women has decreased in 15 years by 7 minutes a day. 7 minutes a day, that's all. And Sean Olney from the ILO, the International Labour Organization, said the glacial rate of these changes calls into question the effectiveness of past and current policies in addressing the extent and division of unpaid care work over the past 2 decades, which is why I feel it's so important to use this moment, this year, to make some real changes. And I think one of the interesting things is that unpaid care and domestic work are so undervalued, and they're partly undervalued because they're mainly done by women. And if more men became involved in caring for their children and doing the work in the home, that would change. And yet, an Oxfam report earlier this year estimated that unpaid care and domestic work contributed 10.8 trillion a year, and that was a conservative estimate to the global economy, which is 3 times the size of the world's tech industry. So care is valuable, and care is valuable also in monetary terms. So if we just look at paternity leave, in terms of laws and policies, because equal, non-transferable paid parental and paternity leave seems to be one of the keys to change. Our chart in our report marked the countries in deep green if they had such leave, in deep blue if they did not, and with a range of countries in between. Things are changing slowly in the right direction, but it takes time and effort and government willingness. And for example, after a long campaign, on July the 1st this year, parental leave for partners was extended in the Netherlands by 5 weeks, up until 2019. But partners and fathers only had 2 days of paid leave. That sometimes surprises people who think that the Netherlands is a very progressive country, but not in those terms. Sometimes these policies are enacted at national level. So obviously something like parental and paternity and maternity leave are national, but they can be supplemented by employers, so the picture is complex. But what is clear is that because of the gender pay gap and many other things, if leave is not fully paid and non-transferable, fathers simply do not take this up. And Christine's going to talk about this a bit later on, but in Europe, I think an average of only 30% of men took the parental or paternity leave they were entitled to. And men were more likely in a Eurobarometer survey to say that they would take family leave only if paid at least 75% of their salaries. But we also acknowledged in the report that it takes more than legislation to change things. So we came up with what we called 5 keys to unlock the power of care: laws and policies, social and gender norms, physical and economic security, couples and relationships, and individual men. So the change is not just at the level of laws and policies and individual men, but many different things in between. And as we can see across 18 countries where the International Men and Gender Equality Survey had been done, large majorities of men in all but a few locations agreed that changing diapers, giving birth to children, and feeding children are the mother's responsibility. This kind of attitude translates into a norm that continues to be passed from generation to generation. UNICEF data show that girls still spend 40% more time on unpaid work than boys of the same age. Which is why we came up with what we called the Men Care Commitment. To reach 50% of unpaid care work equally shared between men and women, time use data analysis finds that men would need to increase their time spent by at least 50 minutes a day. Now, in some countries, that might be 5 hours, but at least 50 minutes a day by taking on specific work that would mean women could do less than 50 minutes a day. And to reach full equality in care, we must also set national goals of achieving equality in care work, measure who does the care, time use is really important, and track progress towards equality. So what kinds of policies do need to change? And we can talk about this a lot more, I think, when it comes to our discussion later on. I've already mentioned parental and paternity leave, high-level commitments by international organisations and governments, investment in care services, that means improved, affordable, quality childcare and elder care as well, and infrastructure. Flexible working from parents and caregiving, I'm going to come back to that in a little while. Policies and practices to prevent violence and to support survivors. Social protection for families vulnerable to poverty, and expanding family and child benefits. Addressing the gender pay gap, making sure women do not disproportionately lose their jobs, particularly women of colour, and collecting data that's disaggregated by gender as well as race, sexuality, disability, etc. I'm just going to turn briefly to COVID and the negative effects on gender equality. I'm sure many of you have done research in this area and know a lot about it, but I'm just going to give a few pointers around, for example, decision making. In many countries, men have dominated decision making around the pandemic, and there's been little analysis of gender or women and men's differentiated needs. In the economy, women care workers make up 70% of frontline care workers, but they're more likely to be furloughed or to lose their jobs. And I think we're going to see more of that as time goes on. Violence, has been an increase of gender-based violence and interpersonal violence in many, many countries. Women and girls in many contexts already eat last, and there's evidence this has been exacerbated. More men than women have died, and I think we're going to be talking about that later too, and more people of colour. And in terms of unpaid care, women have been taking on even more than before. There's been homeschooling and many other tasks that they've had to do along with paid work. A survey by Oxfam and Promundo in 5 countries found that 43% of women said they were feeling more anxious, depressed, overworked, isolated, or physically ill because of their increased unpaid care and domestic workload. And in Nairobi, 42% of women surveyed in their informal settlements said they were unable to do their usual paid work because of increased care commitments. So there are some worrying trends there, I think. But I also wanted to look at opportunities and the positive side. Since the pandemic began, care has been front and centre as never before. Lots of discussions, certainly in the UK and in other European countries and elsewhere, about how important care is, and this could lead to a revaluing of and a reinvestment in care. Governments have had to support care, childcare, family leave, flexible working. Employers and businesses have also had to adapt to more flexible ways of working and allow staff to work from home. And many men have been spending more time with their children and families, and they don't want to go back to the way that it was before. And just a few examples of that. In the US, for example, the share of families with equal sharing of unpaid care work increased. In Spain, too, men increased their participation in household tasks. In the UK, the gender childcare gap narrowed from 30.5% to 27.2%. And in Germany, interestingly, fathers with higher earnings working from home provided more care support. This comes from a really interesting report that UNDP produced. I just wanted to point out as well, though, that women and men don't necessarily agree about how much work men and women are doing and how they're sharing it. This is a US survey, again, as part of an Oxfam Promundo survey called How I Care. And it found that men were much more likely to say women to say that this work was equally shared. The differences are substantial. 47% of men, for example, perceived that cooking and cleaning were equally shared during the pandemic, while only 32% of women did. And even more starkly, 50% of men felt that helping with children's schoolwork is equally shared, while only 30% of women say the same. I'd be really interested to hear of your own experiences of that in the last few months. So just to conclude, because we want to have time for the panel and for discussion, I wanted just to many people will know this already, but Professor Diane Elson, who's a feminist economist, came up with what she called the 3 R's framework, which I always find incredibly useful when thinking about men and care, and particularly around policies. So recognising unpaid and poorly paid care work, which is done primarily by women and girls, and that it's got real value, as I was saying earlier on. Reducing the number of hours spent on unpaid care tasks, and this can be done by affordable time-saving devices and care-supporting infrastructure. Redistributing unpaid care work, not just from women to men, but also to the state and the private sector. And then finally, another one was added to this, was about representation, which feels really important. So representing caregivers and ensuring they have a voice in the design of policies and services and the systems that affect their lives. Finally, I think the pandemic has thrown up many challenges, but it's also presented us with an opportunity for change. An investment in care could be an excellent way to stimulate employment, build equality between women and men, reduce the gender employment gap, and counter economic recession. And an Oxfam report noted that the global community now has a fundamental choice. We can either recycle failed austerity measures, which are likely to further deepen inequalities, or set things right by enabling a recovery that revalues care, encourages men to play full and equitable roles in unpaid care, and builds an inclusive feminist future. And I'm sure everybody listening and everybody at this conference would want to build that future and to encourage men to play a full and equal part as well. So I'm hoping that we'll have a good discussion about what we can do in order to make that happen. Thank you very much.